ladies and gentlemen. It is your favorite Dark Sorcerer here, Angelus, son of Abaddon. And I just completed a video, the first of 3 videos that I got planned on my personal channel. And I'm going to do the same thing here over the next week and a half. Okay? So, the first installment is Nekya, because I've gotten a lot of requests on answering this one thing. What is necromancy? How do you define necromancy? And can you break it down for me? Can you break it down for me? That is the biggest question right there. Can you break it down for me? Can you do the work yourself and look into it? That's what I should say. But you know what? These people that come to me like my channels. They like the Dark Sorcery channel, and they like my channel. They have learned a lot from me as my personal apprentices. Okay, think of yourselves as my personal apprentice. Okay, you are an apprentice to me. Okay, and that's basically what it is. And what's interesting to note here is that the priesthood has been around for a very, very long time in one form or another, much in the same way as the Sith pronunciation of master and apprentice. Nekya is no different in this complex. So, for those of you on Dark Sorcery that love what I do, and those who would like this broken down, congratulations, you got your wish. I'm breaking it down for you in 3 video installments. Okay? So today's video is going to be on Nekya, sometimes spelled with an I-A at the end. But for the most part, Nekya. Nekya. Okay? That's N-E-K-Y-A. Okay? That is the main spelling for it in the most ancient tongue of ancient Greece. Whereas, as you get further in time, it became known as Nekya with an IA at the end. Seeking Serpent 6. How's it going? So, I spent the better part of the day just breaking down a little bit. And so Nekya is an art form that literally has translated time and space itself, and keep having these damn things pop up on me. I have no idea what the hell they are. I think they're associated with my better half's account because we use the same, laptops. So I just said, yeah, keep it on there. But anyways, Nekya is an ancient form of spiritual conjuration. Okay, and it goes back as far as the 6th century. Okay, the 6th century. Picture that, 6th century. And it is sometimes confused with the kata basis and that of shadowmancy, shadow work and stuff like that. So I wanted to break this down into a more clearer definition. Nekya is a rite that is utilized for the summoning of a spirit. Okay, and it's defined as summoning a spirit for communication, fortune telling, basically, past, present, and future, much like you would do with a lot of the goetic demons from the Solomantic practice of grimoire traditions. Okay, and kata basis is the physical journey into the underworld, okay? Think of it as, when you break it down, kata means to go forth. It means to walk forth or to go forth, to go down, basically. And it's very interesting because when you think about this, a few tales over the last 1,000 years have really transcended this. Homer's Odyssey, for an example, where Odysseus went into the underworld through perilous, trials and journeys. Hercules, for an example, had 7 trials or tests that he had to complete for his complete forgiveness, for Hera to leave him alone. Okay? And what's ironic, though, is that you also have what is known as the abstract variation, that of the feminine, like in Anna, Persephone, Sedan, okay, which is Sudan is basically a story of a woman drowning, if you've never read it. And what's interesting about it is that a lot of tales from the old world speak of people going into volcanoes and ending up in the underworld, diving into the deepest pits of a pond or lake, and you end up in the underworld. So in a form, it is a sense of drowning, if you wish, drowning either in lava or in water. Now, others speak of physical doorways, dimensions that allow you to walk into the city of the gods. That's actually South American, by the way, but it's also found in ancient Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, even traditions. And it's really interesting to see how different perspectives really play into the image of what Nekya is. Carl Jung described it as the descent into the dark world of the subconscious. The Jungian perspective of things was more psychological. Okay? Think of St. John on the cross, for an example. He described it as the dark night of the soul. Okay? Very, very interesting. Dark shamanism, either dark shamanism or that of black shamanism, which goes all the way back to the 13th century. You know, it's even practiced today in today's world in both South American and Amazon cultures, not just overseas in European countries or Middle Eastern countries. But shamanism was actually broken down into 3 classifications: art, religion, and a science. And I'll get into this as in a few minutes of why. A renowned Baptist by the name of Andrew Womack defined and broke down the through biblical scriptures the transcendence process, the ascension process, even as being mind, body, and soul. So basically, when you look at it, it's an art form. It's a base of religious worship. And it also deals with sciences when you're dealing with herbs, plants, trees, psychedelics, and other renowned drugs. But also putting things into a physical art form, like dance or music. Shamans are renowned for using drums, much like Native Americans, the Indians, when they do powwows. They have drums playing and dancing and harmony, which is literally a form of an art. But it's also a form of worship as well, a spiritual worship, because no matter what culture you get into, you're dealing with either the spirits of the plants, or you're dealing with spiritual entities such as demons or gods, like, say, Anubis, Hecate, Hel, Thor, Loki, you name it. Pretty cool. you know? And then you have Andrew Womack. Andrew Womack literally took it from a spiritual perspective. The mind was classified in his terms as being your personality. The body is what you see, what you touch, what you feel. And the soul is that divine spark. It is what allows you to transcend from dimension to dimension, multiverse to multiverse, to different planes of existence, even. And like going from heaven to hell, or the nine choirs of heaven and hell, which is very unique because it's said that there are different, realms. There's like 9 levels between the throne of God and humanity, and likewise in mirror image, humanity to the throne of the devil. Which is probably why Carl Jung took the stance that he did. Because when you think about it, he adopted this philosophy of Nekya, the image of Nekya, as being a symbol of the subconscious mind. Now, what do drugs do? Think about that for just a minute. When you get into herbalism and you start dealing with herbs and plants, poisons even. Nicholas Remy, in the first chapter of his book, Demonolatry, an ancient and historical account of witchcraft, spoke on 3 main powders. Black, which kills. A amber colored, which will make you sick. And of course, a white powder, which heals you. Now, what's the most divine, spiritual application that you can think of? The closer to death you become, right? You have these images that flood your mind. You have these spiritual encounters with beings. Those who have died and been brought back to life have some kind of mediumship. They're either feeling what others feel, or they're able to have an idyllic memory and see from all angles. They're able to commune and speak with spirits. Okay, this is basically ancient Nekya speaking here, because of the fact that drugs such as psychedelics they basically give off a false state of perception. They chemically change your mind. Okay, whereas a true, or what is classified, I should say, as a true spiritual encounter, is sitting there with doing, like, say, for an example, let's go with the 13th century extreme form of fasting, the Black Fast, okay, where you eat breads with honey to sustain your body, but you don't really eat much, you don't really drink much, and you go this for like 30 days, okay, and it allows you to get that spiritual encounter. You become closer to death, okay, and that's something that's very interesting, and I think this is what Carl Jung's perception of it was, because it was delving into your own psyche. Even Christopher Penziak wrote in his book, The Temple of Shamanic Witchcraft, breaking down the brain structure and dealing from the shadow aspect to the light, the lower compared to the higher, the alpha state of mind versus the average waking mind, the subconscious versus the consciousness. Okay, and this is where Jung was actually coming from. Whereas Andrew Womack was literally speaking on the spiritual. So when we look at this, we can even go into Francis Barrett's perspective. He wrote the book in the 18th century known as the Magus, Volume 1 and 2. Now, what's ironic here is that he classified Nekya as two stages: rejuvenation of a corpse and that of spiritual conjuration. Now, the abstract variation of this in female terms is that you're bringing yourself back to the more purest form of who you are. Okay? Whereas the spiritual conjuration is you're bringing a spirit forth for divining purposes. You're bringing a corpse back to life by bringing it or guiding a spirit through a form of rejuvenation. So, in this state, we'd have like a golem, or we'd have the zombie effect from Haitian Voodoo or Jewishism. Okay? The kind of basis is basically the gnosis. It's the alternative meaning to that of occultism. Occultism means hidden, that which is hidden, which you have to seek out. You have to get to know, to delve into this. Netherlands. Wow. They're a long way from where I am. But welcome. Okay. So I mean, you can even get into the grimoire systems over the last 1,000 years, from the Grand Grimoire Red Dragon, the Black Raven, also known as the Threefold Coercion of Hell, get into the Red Book of Appen, which is basically the book of Dracula. Okay, Vlad the Impaler. I mean, you look at his mythology and how he supposedly had been killed several times, and yet he still was seen after dark. Okay, that could have just been they knocked him unconscious and thought he was dead, but still, it's there. Okay, so when we get into a spiritual perspective, then you can go into the grimoire traditions and you see the conjuration of beings like Lucifer's Raphael, the infernal scribe and pact maker. You know, the pacto daemonium, which is what is known in the witch's hammer as witches making pacts with devils, or with the devil in their case. Okay. If you go back into ancient Mesopotamia, you see another form of Nekya, that of spiritual pact making with Mephistopheles. Okay. Friedrich Nietzsche's perspective, however, was more of a philosophical perspective as well, which I found very interesting because his gnosis was more based off contemplation. You know, going into Carl Jung's perspective of transcending of the human mind. In this case, you're actually contemplating upon all of the aspects from a how should I say this? From a state of abysmal avenues. Okay. So when you're doing ritual and you're getting into the spirit, as the JCI so colorfully put it, we see where you're separating the sorcerer from the man. Okay. As E.A. Coetting would call it, which is very, very fascinating in general because when you think about it, you really are blocking out the world. You're leaving it behind when you go into your inner sanctum to perform rituals, even meditation. Because in Nekya, you're not only meditating, you're not only using alchemy, you're not only using herbalism, but you're using a form of spiritual conjuration to manifest these spirits in your life, okay, into your inner sanctum to work with you and to build that relationship, that pact, that deal. So when some of these deal makers that we can actually picture throughout history is things like Ereshkigal, Astarte, Persephone, Hel, Eza Mani, Jaime Roar Tapo, and then Anna, aka the abstract, okay, variation outside of the ascender. And then we see other forms, like I said earlier, the masculine, the hero complex, like Beowulf and Grendel, 10th century. Okay, we can go into the old myths of warriors, the way of the warrior, where we see Hercules going through trials and tests, going up against his own family, going up against Zeus, the gods of Mount Olympus. You know, we see the tests and trials of Athena, towards Medusa, even. But the interesting aspects from a masculine perspective, though, would be Orpheus, the one who played the ukulele to put the Devi to sleep, to be able to pass through. Supposedly, he went up against Bacchus, the dream lord. But ironically, Orpheus is also associated with dreams today. So you pick your poison on that one. Odysseus and his journey to the underworld in a form of Nekya, he not only performed rites using blood sorcery and human bones and animal bones, forms of geometric shapes from like Hermetics or Kabbalah even, but you see his transcendence much in the same way into the underworld as you would in Anna, Astarte, Persephone, Erishkigal. But the only difference between them is these heroes are performing feats of heroic heroism. They're there to challenge the enemy, to rescue the dame in distress. Whereas these feminine archetypes were becoming more truer to who they really are. It is said in the Transcendence, each level of hell that they traversed, they would remove an article of clothing, becoming more and more exposed in the views of the population, but in a spiritual sense, becoming more and more true to who you are as an individual. Dante's Inferno, okay, just to name another one, was a philosopher, an artist. He raised sheep and goats, ran a farm. He was banished from his homeland, eventually executed, but not before being imprisoned for years at a time by a cardinal with a stick up his ass. The cardinal was committing so many sins that Dante wrote what we now know as Dante's Inferno. It was made into a play, but in reality, it was based off the 13 levels of hell, with each level of hell worse than the last. We also know that the point and the moral of the story of Dante's Inferno was to show the era of the cardinal's way, the bishop's way, and all the sins that he was committing. He was basically violating every oath that he took as a clergy member. And Dante was literally showing him, this is where you're going. This is what you're doing. Each level had a different perspective, a different sin, pride, sloth, greed, envy, you name it, it was there. Okay? And it was interesting to see because in the very bottom of hell, in Dante's Inferno, and this is the descendant aspect from the male archetype, is that you have the devil encased in fire and brimstone, the mouths, the 13 mouths of the devil, right in the center from the the vaginal region to the crown. On the right hand, you have the warrior, the loyal servants of those who fell and served with him. And on the left hand is Judas Iscariot, reserved for all those who betray, right? So it shows the sins, it shows the transcendence, the spiritualism, the transcendence from reality, the human mundane reality into the spiritual nexus, the void, and then goes beyond it into different degrees, different levels of Nekya. And I mean, and it's interesting because, and it's funny you just mentioned that. What is the difference between modern Satanism and the old Satanism? Because I'm going to get into this here in just a second and kind of break it down for you a little bit. But I'm not speaking on Satanism in this video series, just to let you know. It's very interesting to see because when we get into the JCI perspectives and we start looking at internal torment, it is said in the Bible, the biblical accounts, that those were the light yoke. My yoke is light, therefore I will ascend into the heavens. Whereas a heavy yoke would drag you down like an anchor into the hells, into hell. Kind of like having a guilty conscience or a guilty mind, right? Maybe even a sinful life, your soul stained with the blood of the innocents. If you want to quote Ghost Rider starring Nicolas Cage. I love that movie, by the way. I thought he played an interesting role there. A unique spin-off on it. Talk about Satanism, that's great. It's right there, you know. But you know what I'm saying? But here's the kicker. So the transcendence into the underworld would be the demonic. The spiritual torment, the spiritual guilt, the witch's hammer, the crusades, the dark ages where a demon is behind every plague, every criminal action that you see between the 10th century to the 13th. And even through the crusades, it was a war on religion. It was a religious warfare, not one based off science or who's right or wrong. It wasn't based off good and evil. It was about domination. Even the burning times that we see starting from by 1604, you know, compared to the witch trials, the 10th century to the 14th, or that of the 16th century to the early 19th century. Two different perspectives. Whereas you actually had to prove a witch through drowning, fire, you know, maybe a mole, a birth defect, whatever. Now it's, if you're convicted or even accused, it was about removing an enemy from your turf. It was more of a political stance, a political statement at this point. It was more about the church ruling a king or a queen at this stage. They were dominating. If you are not of my God, you are dead. You are dead. So think about that for just a minute. Well, we know for a fact that in the 5th century, about around 550, in the late Roman period, before the fall of Rome, we see where the church was rejuvenated by the last Roman emperor. And then he also turned around and gave them full authority to start banning things like idol worship. The Knights of Templar worshipped Baphomet, who granted them wealth and power. They rivaled the Vatican, and the Vatican wiped them out because of that. The Knights of Templar were the people's guardians, and they stood between what the Vatican wanted and that of the people. And what's ironic is that when we get into the various different degrees of spiritualism, the abstract, the ascendants or descendants, versus the catabasis, we get into other forms of worship, such as alchemy. We get into shadowmancy. We get into various different other traditions, and seeing how shamanism was closely resembling that of necromancy for a time. Let's take Siberia for an example. Siberia in Mongolia. Buddhism originally tried limiting shamanism in those two regions quite heavily. Genghis Khan, back in the 13th century, led a revolt of shamans, dark shamans, black shamans. And this group was known as the Dark Hag. The word dark and H-A-D at the end. One word, by the way. One word. And you can actually Google that. And it's fascinating because when we get into it, even after the Buddhists relinquished their foothold, we see the Russians do the same thing. We see the same thing. They come in and they start limiting. And then all of a sudden, bam, another war kicks off. We go down into Haiti and we see the guerrillas, who became known as the Bokor, the first form of Haitian Voodoo in Haiti. The revolt compared to their masters, their slavehood, who are Christianized. We see how many people lost their lives because of these traditions. And even today, even in today's world, we see the aspects of psychedelics. We see the spiritual descendants or ascendants, ascension magic, and depending if you're dealing with angelics or demons, if you're dealing with the Ugan or the Lola, maybe even Saint Death herself, Holy Death, Santa Morte. And it's really ironic that Santa Morte can ascend and descend at her own will. A very demanding worshiping spirit. Okay? And what's ironic here is that even when we get into religious perspectives, and this is going to answer some of your questions, by the way, we see forms throughout history of gods being cast aside, punished. Why? Because they helped mankind without permission. In the old days, you have a bliss known as the devil. He's basically equivalent to Lucifer. Why should I bow down to a man of clay when I can be equal with him? We're all your creatures, right? You created us. So therefore, why should we bow down to each other? Why should we be made lower than them? But yet, after the fall of man, the account goes that mankind was placed just below the angels. The spiritual nexus. And these shrubs, these plants were put up so that mankind could not re-enter the Garden of Eden. Shrooms, plants, herbalism. You can eat thereof of anything in here, yet you can't eat of that one tree. Why? Because you would become as gods, knowing good and evil. So therefore, Iblis, Lucifer, Satan, Shaitan, all of these archetypes became the devil. They became the enemy of these Hebraic systems. Doesn't matter if it was Ahriman in Zoroastrianism, Bliss, Islamic, El Shaitan, Islamic, Judaism, Satan or Shaitan, Hebrew, Lucifer, Latin, Set, Egyptian, Hell, or Loki, if you wish, when it comes to Norse mythology. You see, all these beings, Lucifer rebelled, he rebelled against his God because he didn't want to bow down to a man of clay. And his only crime was to ask why. And he was tossed out of heaven, tossed out of the heavens. And it was said that he fell like a shooting star. Isaiah 14:12. How thou hast fallen, Lucifer, son of the morning. Keep going all the way down towards verse 15, and you see that he wanted to set his throne above that of the heavens. But yet we see countless things. Iblis chose to leave heaven and start his own faction, the underworld. El Shaitan, king of the Shaitans, lord of the jinn, the bad guys, supposedly, those who are genies associated with sorcery, witchcraft, not of the JCI. We see another form, the cult of Anubis, or the Athena, the virgin sacrifices, the death cult of Anubis. Or if you want to go back to ancient Babylonia, foot of Mount Hinnom, the giant calf, the boiler, known as the Valley of Burnt Souls. Wonder why? According to mythology in Marduk, or Marduk's, or Moloch's rather, Moloch is known as the Prince of the Valley of Tears. It was said in two different stories that offerings were made to him of flesh. They were tossing human and animal remains into this furnace. But yet the second story says the child sacrificing was done unto him. Unto him, Moloch. I guess the JCI forgot to mention the book of the law. That's right, the book of Leviticus. How many animals do they sacrifice each year to appease their gods? I mean, the tabernacle itself, if you think about it, the blood is put into a chalice placed upon the altar. The entrails removed from the bowels of the animal and just set upon the altar. And the carcass itself let on fire. let on fire. Pour some gasoline on there and go, and supposedly, according to scripture, according to the JCI scripture, their God, Yahweh, got off on it. It clearly states that it aroused him. Aroused him. The scent of death. The scent of dead, burning flesh. Think about that for just a moment. The flesh is burning. You got the entrails boiling under a hot desert sun. And it's creating an aroma of death. And your God is aroused by it? Damn. And yet, Moloch is the evil one. You don't see Moloch telling Moses to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Oh, wait, that was Jehovah. Yeah. Okay. Furthermore, Prometheus, ancient Greek, stole fire from the gods and gave fire to mankind. His punishment was to be chained to a side of a mountain for all eternity, to have his liver eaten repeatedly. So when it gets eaten by vultures, it would just magically grow back and the torment would begin again. And again and again and again for all of eternity. But yet we see the same duality. Slavic, you have Chernobog, the dark god, versus Belobog, the god of light. You have Ahriman in Zoroastrianism, who opposes Ahura Mazda. You have the Sanskrit, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Scroll of Amun, Belial versus Michael. You have the Necronomicon, Marduk versus Tiamat. You have Michael versus Lucifer. And then modern day, God versus Satan. You see, Satanism in one form or another has been around. You just got to know where to look. Patricia and Lionel Fanthorpe wrote one hell of a book on that. And what's interesting here is that even in Nekya, we see the same devilish IOU, so to speak. It was feared, it was hated, but yet it was highly respected. These practitioners lived on the outskirts of town or out in the wilderness by themselves, to the point where you actually had to go seeking them. And yet Azazel is the scapegoat because he taught men how to forge weapons, shields, through alchemy, taught women how to paint their faces in the art of seduction. That's a book of Enoch, by the way. It's also, his name is also mentioned within the book of Leviticus, chapter 10, and again in 16. Ironically, he was the one that supposedly led the revolt originally against their god. But it is fascinating going through culture to culture, how you see the duality between light and dark, the internal and infernal warfare of locking horns for all eternity, just in this fashion. Now it's going to be the kickers when I do the second video to this, within a few days. Just a few days from now, when I do the second one, Nigromancy, the art of black magic. And you're really going to get disturbed about that because you're going to see exactly how all this plays in. And then when I do the third video, at the end of next week, guess what? You're going to see the more modern day variation in why we call it the way it is today, necromancy. You guys wanted it broken down. You got your wish. And thank you. I'm glad you like my knowledge. Yeah, I've been described as a human encyclopedia. I have a idyllic memory and a let's just call it a very deep spiritual gnosis when it comes to that stuff. But and you're welcome, John. But for now, I'm going to end this video here because I don't want to get into the next one until tomorrow or Monday. So, and I got to go back to work tomorrow anyways, and Sundays are normally the, let's just call it the dullest day of the week. So I may just contemplate on doing it tomorrow. I don't know. But it will be there. All right. And thanks, Ollie. I want to thank everybody who's joined this. Seeking Serpent, Holly, John. Not actually, I'm not going to try to, pronounce your name. Mainly because it's like Yado Bo N something. I'll probably butcher it if I do. So, and then Judy Carter. So yeah. Yeah, that's actually ingenious. It's kind of like Jesus Christ spelled backwards as Turk's Edge. That's pretty cool. Nice one on that, by the way. Well, Judy, these aren't going anywhere. They're going to be right here on this channel and my own. So even if your power goes out, you'll still be able to get to them, either before, during, or after. All right? You're welcome. Have a good day.